Hello, I'm Caroline Fairchild, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live. We're covering the Derek Chauvin verdict, its impact on the business community, and how industry leaders are responding. Moments ago, the jury reached the unanimous verdict that ex-police officer Derek Chauvin is guilty on all three counts in the murder of George Floyd. I want to bring in our first guest, Charles Coleman. He's a civil rights attorney and legal analyst. Charles, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. This happened just moments ago, and this is a case that you have been following very closely. Just to start, what is going through your mind right now?
Wow, it was a very interesting day. When we started the day, the jury had the case essentially for its first full day after having heard all of the summations and closing arguments from both the prosecution and the defense yesterday. I did not anticipate a verdict coming today, as many did not. But when I heard the news that the jury had reached a verdict in just under 12 hours, I was pretty confident that at that point, that was a very strong sign for the prosecution. The jury had heard witnesses from the prosecution in excess of 35 or 36, I believe it was 37 witnesses that the prosecution put on, and another 7 or 8 from the defense. There were experts, there was testimony regarding forensic evidence, there were reports, and all of the such. And so for 12 individuals to have a decision made that quickly, unanimously, I knew was a good sign for the prosecution. But there is a brief sigh of relief in terms of the fact that for this case, in this instance, the right call, I believe, was made by the jury. But there is still tons more work that needs to be done.
Well, let's go through the different counts in this case and how the verdict did vote. Derek Chauvin was found guilty on all three counts that he was alleged in terms of second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. For those who are joining us the stream right now and want to know the difference between these, can you walk us through them?
Sure. So it's important to understand that one of the things that the prosecution had working in its favor is that they did not have to establish that Derek Chauvin intended to kill George Floyd. And that was a huge piece in terms of the intent factor, which is normally a significant hurdle in a homicide case, not being present here. So second-degree murder is essentially known as what we like to call in the legal community felony murder. It means that during the commission of another crime, a felony, in this case, assault in the second degree, that a person died. And in this case, it was George Floyd. So what they did have to prove was that George Floyd was dead, which was relatively straightforward, and then that Derek Chauvin was the cause of his death, and that Derek Chauvin caused his death through his actions. And that's when you get to the third and second degree, third degree murder and second degree manslaughter charges that Derek Chauvin was facing. Now, third degree murder essentially says that Derek Chauvin acted so dangerously that it was reckless and created a risk to human life that displayed an indifference about human life. And so that is the reckless charge. And then finally, the second degree manslaughter charge, that charge is related to criminally negligent homicide. Essentially, your actions were so grossly negligent that they resulted in the death of another. And on all three counts, the jury found that he was guilty. But what's important for viewers to understand is that in those cases, intent was not a necessary element for the jury to find Chauvin guilty.
And Charles, I'm curious, what did you see as the most pivotal moment of this trial that led to this verdict? We've seen a lot of conversation, both on and off LinkedIn already, about the moving closing arguments from the prosecution, pleading with the jurors to believe what they saw in that video. But what do you see as the most pivotal moment?
Well, I think the thing that separates this trial and sets it apart is the fact that there were so many different law enforcement officers who testified for the prosecution. If you think back, we don't generally see that. We don't generally see police who are indicted and prosecuted for wrongdoing, particularly state-sanctioned violence against Black bodies. But once we get to the point that there is a trial, if there are trials, you definitely do not see police witnesses at this volume, at this magnitude, testify on behalf of the prosecution. It's usually a blue wall of silence whereby folks are not inclined to question the decision-making of another officer who was in the moment, because the old adage is, well, you don't know how difficult a policeman's job is. Well, in this case, you saw a plethora of different police officer witnesses. You saw the chief of police. You saw the oldest tenured officer on the Minnesota police force come forward and say, this is not what we do. This is not what we're about. This is not what we're trained to learn. This is not what we're trained to do or how we're supposed to execute our duties as officers in this state. And that was very unique. And I think it's extremely important for the prosecution securing a conviction. Not only did it undercut one of the defendant's central themes around saying basically, look, it may not have been pretty, it may not have been nice, but this is what Derek Chauvin was trained to do. It did that, but it also, I think, made it okay in the minds of the jurors who may have been in favor of police or in support of police to feel comfortable voting for a guilty verdict. And that was a huge factor in this case.
And as we look forward to sentences, it's set for about 8 weeks from now. What should we expect from that?
Well, we're going to be looking to see whether there are any aggravating factors that the judge is going to take into account. The prosecution is going to be preparing its presentation around a sentencing memo for the judge, looking to get as much time for the defendant, Mr. Chauvin, in this case as possible. They're going to be collecting letters, witnesses, testimony from the community, from his family, in order to talk about why it is important that the judge go as far as he can in terms of sentencing Derek Chauvin. And so that is what we can expect to see. That's what we will likely see from the prosecution. And 8 weeks from now will be the big day in terms of when we find out what justice in this case actually looks like.
And we're already seeing a lot of discussion around this third-degree murder charge in particular. There's only been one other murder conviction in a police-related killing in Minnesota. That officer currently has a pending appeal before the state Supreme Court. What happens if that conviction is overturned? Can it set precedent for this case?
It is unlikely that, depending on the reason why, to be honest with you, I'm not familiar as to the basis for the appeal. But it really will depend on what the basis for the appeal is in that case and whether it's the same. I find it highly unlikely that it will set precedent that will be utilized in this particular case. It would have to be almost identical in terms of it being analogous in order to have that type of impact. And then the other thing that I'll say about that is that I'm not overly concerned about the level of impact it will have, because you still have second-degree and third-degree murder, which Derek Chauvin has already been convicted of. So the manslaughter, even if in a far stretch of possible events, the manslaughter was somehow reversed because of this other case in Minnesota that's currently under appeal, and the timing of it somehow worked out where within the next 8 weeks that decision came out and was then validated in a way that would be used by defense. In this case, as far as sentencing is concerned, you still have murder 2 and murder 3 that he's going to be sentenced on 8 weeks from now.
And let's zoom out a little bit, Charles, because of course this case is, it's already being lauded as a civil rights decision for the ages right now and is going to set a ton of legal precedent. But I want to bring up something that you tweeted recently on just the cultural ramifications of this case, what it means for society. And you said this is neither the beginning nor the end of the conversation surrounding police violence against Black people. If we allow a conviction to placate us and we walk away, this will happen again. What did you mean when you tweeted that? And what are your hopes as we are moments after the verdict coming out? What are your hopes here?
We have put an inordinate amount of weight on this trial and its outcome, understandably so, because this was a video and a case and an incident that was witnessed the world over, and it sparked the beginning of a racial reckoning in America that actually went from the street to the boardroom. Corporations got involved, all sorts of businesses got involved, wanting to figure out where they could get into the conversation. And so as a result, we have looked at this case as sort of being the pinnacle, when in fact the reality is we should be looking at it as our dungeon basement floor. It should not be that this is the gold standard of American jurisprudence, that we need a video where for 10 minutes in broad daylight, an officer of the law has his knee on the neck of a non-resistant person who was prone and restrained and not giving him any problems on video. We should not need that in order to secure the safety and protection of Black lives in America. And so I don't want us to make this the pinnacle. I need us to understand that there are, unfortunately, myriad cases across the country that do not have video, that aren't witnessed heavily by a number of folks. But yet and still, those victims are still nonetheless equally entitled to their fair justice, as was George Floyd. And so that's the thing that I need us to understand going forward. This is not the beginning, because we've seen other cases like this. This is not the end, because as we know right now, even in the state of Minnesota, currently with Devontae Wright, there are additional cases around police violence against Black people. So we have to, on all levels, on the street, in the boardroom, within businesses, in the C-suite, make decisions and continue to act in a way that keeps the pressure on.
Well, Charles, I certainly hope that you're right. Before I let you go, speaking specifically to the business community, we are going to have millions of people have to go to work tomorrow dealing with the verdict of this news emotionally. Any insight that you can give there in terms of the role that the business community plays specifically in righting some of the societal wrongs that you just listed?
I think that the efforts that the business community began in terms of its conversation around the need to support Black lives and protect Black lives in and outside of the workplace have to continue. If you stop those efforts, if you did not invest in those efforts with sincerity, there are going to be questions, because at the end of the day, this for us, for our community, for Black people at your jobs and in your businesses, this is an ongoing conversation. So the idea that a conviction means that we can now take our foot off the gas with whatever measures were being put in place within business and your organization is a farce, and will send the wrong message to your employees. They still need the support. There still needs to be a serious and concrete investment made, not only in terms of diversity and inclusion, but also culture and race equity within workspaces.
Charles Coleman, civil rights attorney and just advocate for the D&I community. Thank you so much for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.
Thank you.
While still reeling from the news of the Derek Chauvin verdict, millions of Americans will be asked, as we just discussed, to go back to work tomorrow. How should business leaders structure conversation and action against systemic racism? Joining me now to discuss is Kim Crowder. She's the founder and CEO of Kim Crowder Consulting and a diversity and inclusion expert, as well as Janice Gassam-Asari, the founder of BWG Business Solutions and an anti-racism educator. Janice and Kim, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
I just want to take a moment at the top here just to see how both of you are doing. This is something that has dominated this case, and its aftermath has dominated your work for the past year. Kim, I'll start with you. You know, we're just moments after the decision has been made, and I just want to see how you're feeling.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I specifically felt was a deep breath after that verdict came out. Just finally being able to breathe. And I imagine that collective breath wasn't just mine, that it was across the board, that folks were holding their breaths in those moments. And so what I'm feeling right now, I haven't 100% figured it out. I'm sure I will in the next few days. But at this moment, it is a sense of relief at minimum. I want to make sure that that's clear because there's so much more work to do. But at minimum, in this moment, for this case in particular, I'm certainly feeling some sense of relief.
And Janice, what about you?
I think I echo Kim's sentiments, and I feel like it was a sigh of relief for me. I was surprised, if I'm being perfectly honest. I think the system has disappointed me in a number of different ways, but I'm glad that in this particular case, it feels like justice was served. So it feels like a sigh of relief, but of course the work doesn't end and the work doesn't stop. And this is just one piece of the puzzle, but you know, we have to just keep going.
And Kim, I wanted to paint a picture for the viewers who are joining us in the stream right now of just what the past year has looked like for you, for people working in the D&I space, the diversity and inclusion space. What has been your focus? What have you seen on the ground as it relates to this verdict, this trial, the murder of George Floyd and its aftermath?
Sure. One of the things that I would say is companies coming to grips with the fact that they don't know how to handle this. And for me, that is imperative that companies can finally own that, because now you can say, let me pull in someone who can actually do this work and be successful in it. And we see now that companies are open to having discussions. I mean, we weren't even using the phrase, and we weren't even using the word anti-racism in the workplace before this. And so now organizations are having these conversations at large. I think the biggest thing here is that, one, that there's not the assumption that because this verdict has come out, that it's time to end these conversations. And also, here's another thing, is that, one, that it's not only your Black employees who are impacted by this. Let's be really clear about that. And that people are going to have expectations in your workplace based on this verdict, that you continuously move this forward. Folks are gonna wanna know about your policies, as they should. Folks are gonna wanna know where you stand on this. And so I really think organizations need to really begin to think about what does this look like for the lifelong embedding of this in your organization so that you are moving forward and not doing additional harm?
And Janice, Kim mentions that not even a year ago, organizations weren't even using the word anti-racist. Managers were not having open discussions with their employees about what was going on in society. And those same managers, less than a year later, are going to have to walk into work tomorrow and be there for their employees. And I know this is something that you wrote about on LinkedIn earlier this week. What should those managers be keeping in mind right now?
Yeah, I think that's a great question to consider. Some of my clients have already reached out to me about having facilitated listening sessions or conversations in the upcoming days, because even though, you know, the verdict sort of went the way that many people were hoping, we're exhausted. I'm exhausted. A lot of Black folks are exhausted. People in general are just exhausted. So the expectation that we have to come into work tomorrow and show up to meetings and show up at 100% should completely be gone. I think all organizational leaders should cancel meetings tomorrow. And for the rest of the week, I feel like it's been an exhausting last few weeks, I think, with Dante Wright and everything that has transpired in the last few weeks. People are just sort of exhausted, and it's one thing after another. So I think that one of the best things that leaders could do this week is giving employees a lot of grace and lowering those expectations when it comes to assignments and tasks, and understanding that people are just exhausted right now, especially Black employees. So giving them the opportunity to rest is important.
And Kim, you posted on LinkedIn earlier this week as well with this message to managers to stop hiding behind diversity and inclusion efforts. What did you mean by that? And what does that exactly look like tomorrow, next week, next month?
Right. What I mean by that is this idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism. We kind of run all of those words together. And we really don't talk about what exactly that means in the workplace. And what I mean by that is talking about, one, the humanization of folks, using those types of words, but also talking about fatigue, talking about things like when you see things happen in the workplace, we call them people at large call them microaggressions. My team and I call them aggressions. We cross out micro, calling them aggressions. Things like that. So as things are coming up, calling things unprofessional, when people say things in the workplace that are hurtful and painful, particularly around race or anything that could be discriminatory, to start using the real words around this and to really hold folks accountable and to be clear about what exactly this means for your organization, instead of putting these pretty words on it, right? Instead of actually saying, hey, these are our expectations in this workplace. And if you're going to work here, these are the ways that you have to move forward so that everyone gets to feel safe when they come into the workplace.
Well, Janice and Kim, we're already seeing business leaders on LinkedIn bringing in their take on the discussion. We have this just very simple comment from the CEO of Logitech saying this is a huge step for justice. We also have another LinkedIn influencer from Google posting on LinkedIn saying this is a new American first step to the pursuit of life and liberty for all. We have 18 million more steps to go. And Janice and Kim, I know that you remember back in May after the murder of George Floyd, we just saw hundreds of business executives coming to LinkedIn and other places posting similar sentiments like this. But, to Kim's point, let's get to the tea here. What's actually going to have to happen within companies for us to move beyond these statements of support and into actual societal gains for the Black community?
I think a huge part of that the trial has sort of had us re-examine is this idea of accountability. And I always say, it doesn't matter how many mentorship programs and sponsorship programs and employee resource groups you implement, if there is not accountability and if people aren't being accountable for the things that they do and the environments that they create and the words that they are saying, then nothing is actually going to change. And so in our justice system, as well as in our workplaces, we need accountability. That's a huge, huge piece of it. So I encourage leaders to think about, how are we holding leaders accountable for the things that they're doing, the environments that they're creating? Are we evaluating leaders on their ability to create an inclusive environment? So accountability is, to me, what we should all be thinking about and imagining, and what does that look like in our workplaces?
And Kim, I want to go back to something that you said earlier, which was this idea of spotting out microaggressions as they happen in the workplace. As you said earlier, it's really easy to kind of string along all of these terms of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and think about it really high level. But on a case-by-case basis, how can employees do a better job of spotting microaggressions in the workplace and identifying them and calling them out in a way that will mitigate the loss of them when they do happen without anyone saying something?
Sure. The way, one, that this can happen is education. That's a big piece of it. And I want to say this, that education has to come from within. And so what does that mean? That means that leadership has to be educated about what that is. Because what we are finding, of course, is that sometimes it's leadership that's causing these aggressions. And so we need to really see organizations make sure that they understand what that is and then communicate that over and over. It's not a one and done thing, but also, as Janice said, the accountability piece. And I want to say this, when we talk about accountability, we always have to talk about consequences because those two go hand in hand. And so really looking at what are the consequences that happen when you're seeing a pattern in an employee around what we call microaggressions, again, what my team call aggressions, this continuously understanding what aggressions are. They're not just about touching people's hair. They're not just about calling people articulate. It is, as I've, talked to many other folks in this space, it is leaving people off of emails. It is not allowing people to be part of projects in which it could not only move them forward in the organization, but move their career forward overall. It is a continuous saying that there are not enough Black and brown folks who are educated enough to be at the C-suite level, and honoring that if you are in your organization and you're looking around and you're looking at your leadership, and most of your leadership is white today, then likely you have an issue. Honor that today, and then let's talk about what to do about that, right? Let's talk about not only getting people in those spots, but making sure that once they get there, that they're included and that they belong.
And before I let you both go, going back to the verdict that happened just moments ago, of course, it represents much more than a conviction. Janice, I'll start with you. What does this verdict represent for you? What are you hoping for moving forward as we think about the aftermath of this decision?
It represents a step in the right direction. I think similar to our justice system, we have to reevaluate and reimagine our workplaces and what more equitable workplaces actually look like, and understand that it's a system. And I think that, I'm excited that people are excited about the verdicts, but we cannot forget that this is just a system that we have to think about. And, individuals within the system are able to engage in certain behaviors, and we have to think about how do we fix the system. And I think in every system within this country and within this world, we have to reimagine what better systems look like. So we can't focus too much on the individual. So to me, this is a step in the right direction, but I really want us to focus on how do we change and how do we fix and how do we reimagine the system, because obviously the system hasn't been working. So we have to think about what a reimagined system actually looks like.
Kim, any further thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. Great. I'm glad you asked me because I have a few. I love that Janice used the term equity, because that's so important, because often what we find is that organizations don't understand the difference between equity and equality, or only want to have the conversation about diversity, but don't want to have that conversation around equity, because equity means recompense. Equity means having to go back and redo some things and really uproot some things. And so having conversations in your workspace around what equity actually means and what that needs to look like is going to be extremely important. Does that mean you slow down in your hiring processes? Does that mean that you are now taking a look at your core leadership competencies around the things that you require leadership to know around cultural sensitivity, around emotional intelligence, and reevaluating that, and knowing that if your leadership cannot come along, that they have to go. Because if you're doing this work, diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism in the workplace, and your leadership is not being asked to level up, and if they don't level up, they're not asked to leave, then you are in fact not doing this work. And so I really want to make sure that as organizations are reevaluating and doing this work internally, that they're serious about it and that they're willing to do what it takes in order to make their workplace better.
Well, Kim Crowder, Janice Gassamasari, thank you so much for joining us last minute on this show to break down what happened in the verdict today. And if you're following us right now in the stream and you're not following Kim and Janice on LinkedIn, be sure to do so. Their insights on this topic are incredible. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, tomorrow on LinkedIn News Live, we're going to be exploring how emotions are showing up differently at work, especially in a pandemic world. How are we reimagining the way we present ourselves professionally? I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thanks so much for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.